Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It can be difficult to remember given all that has happened in the last 3 years, but I'd like us to envision ourselves back in those first few months of the pandemic in the spring of 2020. In March and April of 2020 alone, the economy lost more than 22 million jobs, and the unemployment rate skyrocketed to 14.7%. Jobs in sectors that are absolutely essential to the American economy were threatened. But after the CARES Act, states were able to put in place expanded unemployment insurance programs to assist workers who had lost their jobs. And census data shows that these expanded benefits kept approximately 5.5 million people out of poverty in 2020. Ms. Dixon, I'm curious about, from your vantage point, how expanded unemployment insurance played out as such a vital lifeline for workers as well as states during the pandemic.
So one of the reasons that Congress put in place these programs is because the unemployment insurance program in the states is inadequate. Inadequate in who it covers, inadequate in how much the weekly benefit amount is. And so when Congress added $600 a week and then $300, that was amazing, especially in states where the average benefit is only, the national average benefit is only $300 a week. And so this made it possible for folks to stay in their homes. They didn't have to choose between food and gas in their cars. It was critical. And I think that, like, part of what we have to do is learn from the successes. So we've talked a lot about instances where there was identity theft and fraud, but we haven't talked about the amazing number of folks who got UI for the first time and what it meant for them and their ability to stay attached to the workforce. And so I think we really have to mine the data on the good pieces and figure out what we can carry forward and what Congress can do to actually carry those pieces forward as a minimum standard for states to implement.
Absolutely. Thank you for that information, because you know, for so much in this hearing, there's a constant focus not just on the notion of the pandemic response being fraudulent or wasteful, but it seems as though a particular fixation on the unemployment program, which, as you stated, if it weren't for the federal unemployment supplemental program, families would have been potentially enduring months of unemployment and having to just scrounge by on as little as $300 a week. And especially when it comes to skyrocketing costs of housing, would it be also in your assessment that this could have also potentially, without that federal response, dramatically expanded the amount of housing insecurity and people who may even be struggling with homelessness if it weren't for that supplemental?
It absolutely did. Because even though there were also things that Congress created that were housing supplements and assistance, it did take a while to get out. And the UI program is the quickest way to get money into the pockets of workers. And so this really did have a critical influence on being able to stay in homes and for folks to be able to pay their rent and to not, and you know, there was an eviction moratorium, but it also means that they're not sitting there with $10,000 of back rent that they can never pay. So it just kept them, you know, it kept them going in a way that made sure that they weren't incurring debt to actually try to just do their basic living expenses.
Absolutely. And you know, despite experiencing the worst job losses, the United States experiencing the worst job losses since the Great Depression during that early COVID period, the COVID-19 recession was also the shortest on record. But to expand on this point that you're making, how did these pandemic relief programs, and particularly unemployment insurance, help stabilize the economy even from a more macro perspective?
So because so much of our economy is based on consumer spending, that's the first thing that families cut back on. And so we know it's kind of like it's an unvirtuous cycle. So there's an economic downturn, there's a contraction, and it just gets worse and worse. And so the UI program actually did what it was designed to do, which was to stabilize the economy, to stabilize communities and state economies, and to prevent that downward spiral and to prevent a double dip recession which we had some experience with a pretty terrible recession not that long ago. And so just being able to get through this pandemic without that protracted recession and also without that protracted high unemployment